M to the A to the R to the K. Well, this is a pretty weird gig. You know that cable network that used to play music videos, Mark TV? Well, they asked us to put together some spots that harken back to the days when their on-air branding was super weird and cool. The concept is really simple. You've got some handheld shots, you've got weird alien creatures designed by David Brodeur, and you've got a thumpin' music track. We need you to comp the creatures into the scene and make it look really good, as realistic as you can. We're hoping you can knock out a couple of these spots, and we'll let your understudy do the other ones. They're not half bad. Thanks.
Let's take a look at the reference video that we have from the client. Interesting. What do you make of that? Let's take a look at what we've got in the project. My first impression of the reference is that this looks anything but realistic, and its creature behavior seems to be, it pulses. So let's take a look at what else we've got. We have a couple of Cinema 4D models in this project, and I've already opened one of them over here in C4D Lite, which is what we all have on our systems. So let's see. Oh, there it is. And it looks no more realistic in this shading than the one we were looking at in the rough cut, but it does a little dance. I kind of like it. And then we can take a look at the other one. So there are two called Floaty McGee, and you're going to be getting these same elements when it comes your turn to do the exercise. And then we've got Spike Tyson. Spike does this little spike dance. And here is our other Spike. Similar, some different colors. We have a few different objectives this week, and one of them is to get you familiar with incorporating 3D models into your After Effects camera track and match moving them in. So we're going to be making use of Cineware, which is Cinema 4D's link to After Effects. If you're not familiar at all with Cinema, don't worry about that at all. This will mostly be focused on After Effects. We'll have bonus lessons for those of you who are interested in the 3D portion, but we're going to just show you how you might make use of this bridge and just more generally how you might go about incorporating 3D into your comps. As you already know from the lesson earlier this week, I like to just run tracks to start with to see what we're working with. So I'm going to go ahead and do exactly that. Camera track there, camera track over here. Now there's something you should immediately notice about this scene, and if you don't notice it just looking at the points, you certainly will once I move my cursor around it or even scrub through it. And that is that these points are all moving entirely together. They're the exact same size, and they are all the same distance from the camera. Of course, we know that the details in the scene are not the same distance from the camera, and this seems like a mistake. But in fact, this is a special type of track, sometimes called a nodal pan, or as After Effects calls it, a tripod pan. I'll twirl down my advanced controls, and you can see that After Effects has correctly used the tripod pan method on this. Now, why is that correct? Well, if you study the shot and you have any familiarity with the way a shot looks when it's just a camera panning around off of a tripod, this is what you get. And the reason that all the points are the same size is that there is no depth information being created by camera movement. Instead, with the camera just panning around, there's no way for After Effects to tell which points are closer and which ones are further. That's not to say that we are just stuck with 2D. we can bring dimension into the scene, but we're not going to get it from the camera tracker. So to kick this one off, I'm going to choose an area right around where I want to place Spiky McGee. Right about here looks good. And I'll just create a solid and a camera right there. And actually, I'm going to undo that. What I wanted to also do, let's actually select some points so that I can hold one point steady. And I'm going to first choose to set the ground plane and origin right here. That's not entirely correct because the ground plane right now would be facing the camera. But I'm going to go ahead and do that anyway. And then right click once again and create solid and camera. Now, normally you would actually want to choose points that are along the ground plane and have the solid and the target lying on the ground to do that. And in this case, it's just simply not an option. So the result that I have here, if I look at the position, is right at the 0 point. So I have set the center of my 3D universe. It's just pointing the wrong direction. We'll take care of that separately. Let's take a look at the other track. Now, this track is going to be a big success. And the reason for that is there's a lot of great detail in the scene, a lot of dimension. There's not a lot of camera distortion here. There's just a lot for the tracker to chew on. And there aren't really appreciable changes in lighting. So here we're going to have a really good initial track to work with. The average error is 0.47. I'm going to leave this for now, and we're going to move on with the other shot. Back over here, all I need to do is rotate the world. And for that, I will add a null object. I could have done this in the same pass as when I set the origin and create the solid, but I'll just do it now. New null. Let's check its position. We want this to be 3D, and I'm just going to zero out the position so it's the same as the solid. And now I'm going to rename it world null. I'll rename the solid ground plane. I'm going to parent the camera to that null. And to show you what I'm doing, I'm also going to open up a second view here. And this is from the left side. And you can see the camera's pointing straight down. And I would like it to be pointing more across. So virtually 90 degrees from what we're looking at right now. So to achieve that, I'll rotate the null with the camera parented to it. And what you'll see, that may be upside down. It may be, yes, I need to go this way. And something like that is probably what I want. To make it a little clearer, let's add a grid to that solid. And then I'll just go ahead and scale it up. That looks pretty good. I would say that I could further adjust this a little bit flatter. It's a little too far. If I hold down the command key, I can use finer increments, and that looks pretty good. And likewise in this view, that looks about like what it would be. We're looking uphill, so maybe the ground plane's not actually flat here, but I'm not going to worry about that. It's all relative. And that's a perfectly fine place for me to, I'm ready for the next step, which is to add the creature. If you're not working with an outside 3D animation application such as Cinema 4D, what I just did isn't as significant, although it still can be helpful to have the world oriented in a way where Z is straight back from you and things make sense according to how the default camera would be pointing. Here, the ground plane is, as I showed you clearly, on a slant, and I decided to make it as if flat. Now, certainly there are cases in match moving where you would actually want to match a slant. Let's suppose you had a ramp and then surrounding platforms that were actually meant to be actually flat. And in that case, it would really help you in your 3D world if you did that correctly. Here, the variables are really down to if you're the 3D artist, what are you going to want to work with? And if you're a match move artist, you're often trying to make it as easy as possible on that 3D artist. A little housekeeping. I'm just going to move these layers to the bottom of the comp. Command Shift left bracket to do that. I guess the ground plane needs to sit above the plate if I want to see it. So go ahead and move that up here. And next I'm going to add Spike to the scene. So there is Spike Tyson, Command / we'll add him right in there. Let's go to one view. Take a look. He is 3D, but he's not going to move with the scene right now. And there's this ugly grid. So to get rid of the grid, let's change the renderer to OpenGL. Standard, Final, and Draft are very slow to render. OpenGL is fast and no grid. The lighting is obviously terrible, and this is very flat shading. We'll get to that. But for now, what we want to do is get our camera into Cinema. And you see an option here for camera, and I can choose comp camera. Now the model got very big, and that is because my world is too small. So I can use that null and scale it, and this time I'm going to use the timeline for this. So S in the timeline reveals scale. And I'm going to scale up the world. I'm going to hold down Shift to do it so I can scale a lot. And just kind of pick my framing here. I think something like that will be great. Now, nothing changes to the source model in Cinema 4D yet, but we are able to preview the motion. So actually, let's see what we've got. So in case you hadn't picked up on it already, we are going to be exporting this camera track to Cinema 4D. In fact, that's the next step. And you don't have to do it that way. Cinema 4D has its own camera tracker, but we are having an After Effects class and we know how to use the After Effects tracker. So that is our starting point here. And so I'm just basically making it all work as well as possible once it's over in Cinema 4D. Now, if I want the camera in my Cinema file, under the Cinema plugin, there's a merge into Cine, the comp camera. So let's do that. Apparently it was merged, and now we're going to go to Cinema 4D. And there's no immediate change here. I don't see a camera. So what I'm going to do is revert this project. Because what After Effects did was not only merge it, but save that project. So now you see a camera, and I will just switch to it. And now, there it is. In the upper left, you can see that motion of the trail. Back in After Effects, the camera has round tripped, and we now have match motion happening in the scene, and that is the name of the game for this week's topic. So just like that, we got a nodal pan all worked out. Obviously, what we haven't done is really anything to integrate this 3D model into this scene. So the supposition we're making here is that you would like to learn how to work if you're not in control of the 3D element, although it would also help you to know how to communicate with whoever that person is. In possibly the majority of cases of people in this class, you are actually going to be fluent in Cinema 4D and able to make your own elements. But we all find ourselves at different times in positions where we're actually relying on someone else to do that. So in some facilities, you would break up those two jobs, or in some cases, you would be working with 3D software that's not what you usually use. Maybe somebody's making something in, I don't know, Houdini or Maya for you. And so some of what I'm saying here is still going to apply even if you're really fluent in cinema. Before we move on, let's just talk about matching, and particularly matching an element that has no real world analog. We're working with something that we don't really know what it's supposed to look like, and its color and shading and everything are kind of arbitrary. And let's say that we're even waiting on a renderer and we want to get started with the matching process. We could actually do that. Here's a gradient. Now just look at this thing for a second. And if you think about our RG&B matching that we've been doing, this thing obviously doesn't match. Would it make sense to match this in and then apply that to the 3D render? Well, it certainly could, especially if the 3D render is fairly neutrally lit or has some neutrally lit passes, because then, well, rather than tell you, why don't I just show you? I'm going to use a levels effect here, and that's going to let me be pretty precise with color numbers. So, as you know, I can move my cursor around the scene and look for the darkest black. And over here in the shadows, we're at about 0.15, 0.16 in the RG&B, and they're all even. So the blacks in the scene don't have shading. That's actually a good thing. That means that the scene overall is probably color balanced, at least in the blacks. So where there's no color, they're lifted somewhat. They're not pure black, and that's why that's not matching. So all we have to do, as you already know, is lift the black. And what I might want to do is make it so just above the bottom, we're at about that number that we saw, sort of the mid-teens. So that means I want to go lower for absolute black, just so I've still got room to go all the way down. And something like that is what I'm looking at. If you look at my info panel over here, while I move my cursor around, you can see that just above the bottom, we're there. And visually, you can kind of see it's closer, but obviously now we got to deal with the white, and by doing so, the gray, and clearly those are not neutral. So again, using the info panel, I'm going to look for a very brightly lit part of the scene. So some of the rocks that are reflecting light, and granted they're dusty, so they're not meant to be neutral, but we don't have anything truly neutral in this scene. So we're going to go with the closest thing we've got. And overall, there is more red than green and more green than blue. Looking at the info panel, you can see the rough proportions. So let's just go for that. So what I'm going to do up here is, again, I'm going to take the edge off the white a bit. And then in individual channels, I can increase the white contrast in red and decrease it in blue. And that looks roughly like the proportions I saw, actually. And you can see visually that it actually kind of matches. Now, to put this to the test, I'm going to rename this overall CC. Copy it, turn off the grad layer, and skipping ahead in time, I'm magically bringing in Joey's completed scene with his lighting. You can see we have a very vibrant Spiky McGee here. So let's see what happens if I apply this. Boom. Okay, well, it is not perfectly matched, and yet you can see that it is more believably in the scene. And a perfect match, again, is arbitrary. Maybe this thing has very vibrant, glowing color. However, to match it in this case, one thing I would do is just add some desaturation. I'll just use hue saturation for this. I'm just going to come down on the saturation because basically, again, if he's grayscale, he's going to match anywhere in here. But if he gets too saturated, he starts to kind of seem really unreal. Now, maybe we want that. Maybe he's self-illuminated and doesn't match the scene at all. But more believably, he's less saturated and is getting this color correction to get him integrated. So here, blacks don't match, they're too deep. Here, blacks kind of match. And of course, it is arbitrary. What do you like? What do you want? And we're going to get back to matching spike in all the way. But that was just a little clue for you of how color matching can be done when you don't have either your foreground element or proper reference in the background. You guys would have every right to ask, Mark, why do you enjoy color matching so much? It's the kind of thing it feels like the computer should just do automatically. Well, if I hadn't said this before, the tools to do that mostly fail because at the end of the day, this is a subjective process. We have a background scene here that, for all I know, has no real gray or white elements. It has blacks because there are areas lacking light, but they're not giving me much information. They're actually neutral. So all those are telling me is that this scene seems to be, at least in the blacks, to be balanced. But the dust on the trail, the rocks, are any of them neutral? Probably not. At the same time, the way the scene's going to be lit in 3D is also going to use some reflective light. And that is because in a scene like this, especially with the diffuse daylighting, a lot of the color of the light is not only going to come from the sky, which would be cool light from the sun, but also from the ground, which has this warmer, earthy tone to it. Now, if you don't like that, and you want to go against that, there are many reasons you might choose to do that. This alien creature may be somewhat self-illuminated, and therefore it probably should also cast a glow. Or maybe, I don't know, you just come up with your own look that you like. I'm really starting at the place where we're using received knowledge from what's in the scene to match it. And the reason that I enjoy it is just I love watching the element just kind of transform and using that as a starting point, after which, yeah, I'll push it back in whatever direction, in this case, brings it to life. Having matched it like this, I have some freedom now. Notice that if the saturation is right, I could actually dial the hue around, and the object basically matches equally well wherever I am on the spectrum. So, as you've probably experienced, when you don't have a clear gray, black, or white in the scene, it can be hard to do this color matching methodology. And clearly, if we had a grayscale element, and we're just matching that, where the hue no longer matters, then my grayscale adjustment would work. But it still works even if I do have saturation in the scene. So if you use your imagination and, well, basically just think of this as being a character that does change color all the time, then somewhere in here, I would find the right saturation level. That's kind of nice. Where I would actually buy that this is a chameleonic, ooh, I like that word, chameleonic character, changing his skin throughout the scene, but matching perfectly. As you've already experienced, it's not uncommon to get a foreground or other element that you have to match that lacks either a pure white or pure mid-gray, or even a pure black, whether the black is pure black or a lifted black. Sometimes none of them are neutral. The method that we're using is going to provide a starting point using neutrality. And when you apply it to a non-neutral element, it won't necessarily finish that element, but it certainly will be a starting point. In this case, I'm assuming that any lighting you would do to this scene would be fairly neutral because you're matching sunlight, which, yes, it's slightly bluish and it's a little bit cool. And so I am going to be warming that up. If you use lighting that's already warm, then this may make it look too warm, so in which case you can just, back off. But if the scene's properly lit to match in a basic way, this should help take it the next step without making you go through this process in 3D, which is what you really want to avoid. Here we're going to repeat a process you've already seen me do. There are just a couple variations to talk about in this case. One, the sunlight is coming here really strong. It's going to cast very clear shadows. You can see examples of it here, and it's going to cast them on sometimes uneven objects if we put, say, a floaty McGee right here, which is what we want to do. But also, I want to prepare to put multiple objects into the scene. And that just means to help myself out in cinema, because again, we're dealing with an arbitrary sized universe, that I want to place solids kind of at, or in the case of the floating ones, below where I want them to go. So here we go. I'll take my selection tool. I could just click and create a solid in camera right here, but I first want to set my ground plane and origin, and that's best done by actually selecting points so that that stays in one place. I set the ground plane and origin, and then with it still selected, I can make my solid and camera, and then the solid is sitting right there at 0, 0, 0. Now it's interesting that the solid is at an angle. Before we move on, let's just take a look at what's up with that. So here in the top view, you can see that indeed the camera and that solid are at different angles, and possibly in an ideal world, I would actually want the camera to be rotated around so that it's more directly facing forward. Now you've seen me solve that by parenting the camera and all of the solids to the solid that is at the center of the world. But we've held off doing it until we get all of the data we want from the camera tracker. And in this case, we're not done yet, because I want another solid back here in the background. So let's see. I'll just click to deselect what I had before. Now, that actually looks great right there. I was going to select points, but I can just create a solid. And then I want one more here in the foreground. I think I'm even going to roll backward, somewhere like that. So here we have come to the first choose your own adventure part of this lesson. Now I'm assuming you're going to go ahead and watch the rest of this and stick with me using pre-rendered elements. However, this is the point at which, rather than me try to walk you through how to set this up in Cinema 4D, we kick that to Joey to just give you a bonus lesson that specifically deals with how he set up these scenes, and in particular the one we're going to work with now.